We're live.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Bice. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action and a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, a past secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council. We acknowledge that we are hosting this event on Indigenous lands, including the unceded territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Wendat and Haudenosaunee people. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's webcast is titled, Will the Pandemic Ever End? It is a question on the minds of millions of people. The speakers are Daniel Torade in Toronto, Siobhan O'Brien in Toronto, and Robbie Mahood in Montreal. So Daniel will speak for about 20 minutes, followed by Siobhan for 10 minutes and Robbie for 10 minutes. Then we will take questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the website directly from YouTube and by typing the questions directly onto the chat column. Please direct your questions, if you wish, to a specific person. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca. Or you can give us a call at 647-986-1917. So, let's begin. Daniel Torade is a member of the Socialist Action National Leadership Body and a PhD student at the University of Toronto in Laboratory Medicine Pathobiology. He is also the author of a new essay booklet. There you are. It's Democratize and Nationalize Scientific Publishing. So please, welcome Daniel.
Hi, folks. Brothers, sisters, siblings, comrades, welcome for another webcast on the coronavirus. It's provided us with a lot of material to critique and discuss and analyze the capitalist system we all find ourselves in. So let's start with just an analogy. Fire needs three things. It needs fuel, it needs oxygen, and it needs heat. And a pandemic also has some similar requirements. It requires a virus that can infect people. It requires humans that can be infected, and it requires those two things to be in contact with each other. A pandemic will continue as long as the virus is still around and there are still susceptible people and they're in proximity to each other. And we'll be discussing all these three different things today and the ways in which the capitalist system actualizes these requirements. How does the profit motive in agribusiness bring about new zoonotic viruses? Why are poor and racially oppressed people the fuel for the pandemic? And why is capitalism so impotent to respond to the pandemic, instead yielding to reactionary forces? So I'll focus on the first question: where do pandemics emerge from? And this is not meant to divert away from COVID-19. It will circle right back, but we need to study what's been happening in the last 20 or so years with respect to pandemic viruses emerging within our industrial farms. Because the question shouldn't be, will this pandemic end, but how long until the next pandemic as well? So let's start off with a truism. All viruses that infect humans evolved from a virus that didn't infect humans. And this has to be true because viruses predate multicellular organisms. But there's this narrative built around infectious agents then that they're natural. And this is obviously true, but it's not simply a case of our scientists, our medicine, and our vaccines against their viruses, bacteria, and parasites. This ignores the way our capitalist society constructs and destroys our environments, often in ways that create the most perfect incubators for pandemic viruses and superbugs. So we can jump back to industrialization for some classical examples, like when workers were forced into slums, which spread tuberculosis like wildfire. And lest we not forget, until the early 1900s, tuberculosis was the leading killer in the industrial world. Then there are examples like the so-called Spanish flu of 1918, where the virus was spread along with troops who were deployed to fight in an imperial war in Europe. European countries muzzled their media and prevented them from reporting on the pandemic, which was ravaging people on the front lines. And with the exception of neutral countries like Spain, that's how we got the Spanish influenza moniker. They were the only place where the newspaper was reporting on what was a very deadly virus. And yet, despite the muzzling, or maybe because of it, in America, you had cities still holding war bond parades. And most notoriously in Philadelphia, thousands of people died within a week of a very large war bonds parade that went ahead despite pleas from health officials and scientists. So maybe we can think about how that's not too dissimilar today. But Siobhan will talk more later about how the current government and corporate decisions provide the human fuel for the current pandemic. But I want to focus on agribusiness. Because remember, any new virus with pandemic potential, well, most of them are going to come from viruses that currently infect some other species. That's the reservoir. And then if it spills over into humans, that can be a new pandemic. So it really shouldn't be a shock that many of the great health scourges of the 20th century erupt from industrial farms. We can first talk about the H1N1 swine flu of 2009, which was a pandemic. Fellow socialist and scientist Rob Wallace argues that this strain ought to be called the NAFTA flu, as it most likely originated on a pig farm owned by the Smithfield Corporation that was located near the epicenter of this pandemic in Veracruz, Mexico. The American-owned Smithfield began consolidating farms in Mexico in 1994, the very year that NAFTA went into effect. And like all free trade agreements, NAFTA allows capital to cross borders with impunity, while people fleeing violence and austerity cannot and are instead criminalized. The Smithfield Corporation set up shop in Mexico specifically because environmental regulations were lax or non-existent, but they can still then bring the produce back into America and Canada without paying tariffs. So although we can geographically link the 2009 pandemic to Smithfield, it's the genetics of this virus that instead indicts a whole capitalist system. So the 2009 pandemic strain of swine flu resulted from the mixing and matching of at least 4 different H1N1 strains, one endemic to North American avian, so birds, one endemic to North American swine, one endemic to Eurasian swine, and one endemic to humans. Now, it's been known for some time that influenza can swap bits like this when an animal is infected by 2 different viruses. Different genes can be swapped between the two, but this was basically unprecedented to have so much shuffling between so many different species. Now, most of the time when things start swapping around in a species, the new hybrid that's produced is just junk, an evolutionary dead end. But every once in a while, a highly virulent, highly pathogenic strain can emerge. And it's really just a numbers game. It's just random chance whether or not the reassortment can go on to kill millions of people or go on to not infect anything at all. So really the defense against this is to minimize the numbers. But unfortunately, there's evidence that this process of recombination and reassortment of influenza is accelerating. In fact, until 1998, the H1N1 strain that circulated in North American swine was considered to be stable. Meaning if you looked at the genetics of H1N1 in North American swine in the 30s, it looked very similar to that in the 80s. But something really troubling happened in 1998. That was the first time we really saw a recombination, an outbreak of new H1N1 strains in North American swine. And basically every year since then, new virulent forms have been appearing on pig farms across North America. So people shouldn't have been surprised that 2009 happened. But some people might still ask, is there a structural systemic reason for this acceleration in new influenza emerging? Or is it just simply nature? You know, some years you get a pandemic, some years you don't, and you just cross your fingers. Well, referring back to Rob Wallace, the socialist scientist, they argue that vertically integrated stock breeding, which originated in the 70s in southeastern USA, and since became the business model of choice around the world, is the existential threat. Vertically integrated stock breeding involves thousands of monoculture swine and avian cramped together in pens and lots, sometimes together, and shipped all around the world. And that's really the only way you could ever get something like the 2009 pandemic strain, where it has Eurasian and North American swine and avian and human bits all mixed and matched. With this globalization, corporations predominantly take advantage of countries in the so-called global south, where labor is cheaper, regulations are lax, and the terms of International Monetary Fund loans weaken animal and health infrastructure, which has been happening in Mexico since the 80s. So we shouldn't be surprised either that the swine flu maybe emerged in the very place where these regulations were being undermined, specifically so corporations can profit. Although the pandemic virus of 2009 turned out to be less deadly than health officials feared, it only infected 1/5 of the world's population and it only killed 500,000 people. The subservience of agricultural practices to a profit motive threatens us repeatedly. So this might be nightmare fuel for some of you, but I'm just going to name 3 viruses that are very deadly, can infect humans, but to date, there has not been sustained human-to-human transition. We can first talk about H5N1 avian flu, which first jumped to humans in Hong Kong in 1997. And since 1997, of 861 confirmed cases in humans, 455 deaths are the result. So more than half of those infected have died. Then there's the Nipah virus, which can spread to humans either via bat or pig. And this was first identified in 1998. And this periodically erupts in places like Malaysia, Singapore, and India. And although there have been only 700 confirmed cases in humans, the case mortality rate is around 70%. So 3/4 of those infected go on to die due to encephalitis, so brain swelling. Horrible way to go. And fun fact, the movie Contagion was based on this virus gaining the ability for sustained human-to-human transmission. And then there's the coronavirus that causes Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, which was first reported only in 2012. And it spreads to humans primarily from camels. And of the 2,500 confirmed cases in humans to date, there's a case mortality rate of 35%. So all of these are way more deadly than SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, or even the swine flu of 2009. And so we're just really lucky that there hasn't been sustained human-to-human transmission with these viruses. But that doesn't mean that we're not creating the situation where that might happen. Viruses are jumping from other animals to humans every year, and this process is accelerated by intensive agribusiness that forces thousands of animals into close contact with each other and with humans, either those working in unsanitary conditions or those residing in slums that are often nearby these agribusinesses. And even though these viruses that are deadly aren't being transmitted between humans really readily, that can all just change in a blink of an eye. There's some research with H5N1 where they've identified that it only takes about 2 to 3 mutations for sustained transmission between humans. And so we're just kind of hoping that that doesn't happen. But hope and prayer only gets you so far when you're dealing with just the natural process of evolution. So why is this allowed to continue? Well, this whole process is accelerating while an infinitesimally small number of capitalists profit from this process. And meanwhile, the costs of any pandemic that does happen are externalized to the working class. For every pandemic that happens, our governments provide billions in de facto subsidies to these agribusinesses that are responsible for the pandemic in the first place by themselves picking up the tab for vaccines, medicines, healthcare, and reimbursing farmers for culling livestock. So we're paying them, and we're paying to clean up their mess, basically. But even beyond the subsidies, which result in new waves of austerity and public sector cuts, which we're now threatened with, people keep asking, how are we going to pay for all this COVID relief? Well, it's going to be us that pays for it. But beyond the financial impact, it's our lives that are upended and our bodies in the ground. So finally, let's talk about SARS-CoV-2, the new coronavirus that causes COVID-19, the pandemic we are currently mired in. So based on genetic analysis of SARS-CoV-2, it most likely originated in bat. If you look at the genetic material of this new virus, it's nearly identical to a coronavirus that has been isolated from bats in a region near Wuhan. So people had already known that there are SARS-like viruses circulating in bats and in regions not far from where humans are. But these warnings have not been listened to because the trade of live animals is also a big market. From the bat that initially was a reservoir for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, there are many routes it could have taken to eventually infect humans, but most focus on the wet markets in Wuhan, where live exotic animals are cramped in cages. So it could have gone through civets, it could have gone through raccoon dogs, or even some other species. We don't really know that. But it's clear that these conditions really allow for the spread of new zoonotic viruses to humans. And this is not surprising. Health officials and scientists scrutinized those wet markets after the SARS outbreak of 2003, when scientists found that civets and raccoon dogs and workers in wet markets were found to carry the coronavirus that causes SARS. And after SARS, China banned the trade of wildlife, but this proved to be temporary because, again, there are business interests at play. In 2003 as well, the Chinese government also impeded scientist Guan Yi in reporting the outbreak and distributing samples for analysis. So maybe this is reminiscent of what happened in early 2020, where there were also doctors who blew the whistle about a new mysterious pneumonia and were punished by the Chinese government. But in both cases, the Chinese government did eventually rally to contain the virus within its borders. The way Canada, Europe, and USA are currently being ravaged by COVID-19, the same is not true for China, or for that matter, Taiwan, Vietnam, Singapore, or even Australia and New Zealand. So there are ways of dealing with this, but we can see that our health interests are often pitted against for-profit interests. And I won't get into a long analysis on China here. China is clearly a capitalist nation, albeit it is one where the state owns a stake in many enterprises, including outright owning the dozen or so largest corporations. And I imagine that this incentivizes stronger action from a centralized government to contain an outbreak, more so than what we see in North America and Europe, where individual private corporations fight for themselves to the detriment of others, and even the economy as a whole. You can imagine how the cruise ship industry and the airline industries are fighting to keep their services going, despite the fact that this accelerated the global spread of a new virus. Now, even if we do concede that for-profit agribusiness fosters the ideal conditions for pandemic strains of viruses to emerge, some might imagine that the solution is just greater investment in technology, in medicine, or in vaccines, more surveillance. So we're just going to build up the agribusiness, but we're also going to build up the apparatuses around agribusiness to prevent the jump of zoonotic viruses to humans. And maybe there's a reason for people to be hopeful about this. After all, Pfizer just announced that its new vaccine is 90% effective. And there's reasons to be skeptical at this point. It's very unusual, as they admit, to announce preliminary results of a clinical trial without releasing the raw data, without having gone through the peer review yet. And there's also the fact that the Pfizer CEO sold over $5 million in stock on the very day the news broke. So maybe this is just a pump and dump. Their excuse was, we want to provide hope to people. If you want to provide hope to people, selling off a bunch of stock at the same time makes people skeptical and makes people distrustful of vaccine companies. So that's something to weigh in as well. But even if the final clinical trial results show that the vaccine is safe and successful at preventing infections, agribusiness again is threatening us with a twist ending. So Denmark is the largest mink fur producer in the world. And currently, 20% of mink farms in Denmark have had COVID-19 outbreaks, but not in the humans that work on these farms, in the mink themselves. These mink initially got sick from workers, and then it spreads. Again, they're held thousands cramped in small cages. And so it's just gone throughout the whole country. And it's also infected mink in Spain, in the US, the Netherlands. So it's really just jumping around everywhere. What's scarier, though, is that in a small number of cases, the virus that causes COVID-19 jumps back to humans from the mink. And there's a particular cluster. It's only 12 people infected in Denmark, but scientists studying the virus isolated from these humans is something really troubling. They found a mutation in the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 that has not been noticed before in human populations. And that's not surprising because the mink has different receptors on its cell that SARS-CoV uses to enter, or at least the receptor is slightly different, which provides different selective pressure, and then the virus might mutate in a different direction. Well, what that means when it comes back into humans is that the vaccines that we're creating now to counter the SARS-CoV-2 that's been circulating so far in humans might not be effective or less effective against this potential strain that can now spread through humans. And they actually have some preliminary results where they've taken the antibodies from COVID-19 survivors and used it to try and neutralize the virus taken from cluster 5. And they found that it's less effective, suggesting that our immune systems don't recognize the virus from cluster 5 in exactly the same way it recognizes the virus that's been infecting other humans. And so again, we have a case of agribusiness. I mean, Denmark, they're the biggest fur producers in the world. And the fear here has prompted such drastic action, but we don't know if it will be too late. But that drastic action is they've ordered the culling of every single mink. In Denmark, 17 million mink. The army is basically going around and you have mass graves of mink to try and contain this before it establishes itself in the human population, and it threatens to undo the work in discovering a vaccine. So this is obviously a story in progress. How this will go, we don't know, but it's very clear that the conditions of agribusiness are prompting, allowing for pandemics, and it's also making it way harder to contain them once they erupt into the human population. And beyond SARS-CoV-2, it's clear we're rapidly approaching a situation where the system cannot keep up anymore. There's a recent report from the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Came out earlier this year. And one thing they highlighted is that every year there are 5 new diseases emerging in people from viruses that came from animals. Any one of these might be the next pandemic. 5 in a year. And again, to have a pandemic strain, the numbers are stacked against the virus. It's hard to find the right amount of virulent contagiousness. But this is a major, major problem. They also estimate that 1.7 million viruses remain undiscovered in avian and mammalian hosts, and that 1/3 to 1/2 of these unknown viruses carry the potential to infect humans. But not unlike the Intergovernmental Platform reports on climate change that we cite a lot, there's a bleak prognosis that hangs when you read the report, but these bureaucratic institutions cannot provide a vision for system change because they are a part of the system. The solutions that emerge from neoliberal governments will only address some of the symptoms of a system in crisis, and they will disproportionately benefit wealthy populations while the rest of us suffer the consequences, whatever they may be. Because this is not a problem that requires a simple band-aid. The connection between agribusiness and pandemics betrays an inherent contradiction in capitalism, much like the connection between big oil and climate change. Vertically integrated, globalized industrial farms are the inevitable conclusion of competition among for-profit corporations. Integration, scaling up, and outsourcing to the so-called global south are measures corporations need to take to combat the tendency for the rate of profit to fall due to competition between these corporations. They're all looking for a competitive edge. But then it's clear that capitalism inevitably leads to the destruction of the environment and exploitation of people and animals alike because it requires perpetual growth. And we have only finite resources on this planet. So in this time, we can fight for reforms, but we must not settle for reforms. Simply pleading with the capitalists to play nice will not work, and it has not worked. If we build strong enough movements, they might retreat for a little while, but they will come back with a vengeance and with a whole new cycle of austerity, deregulation, exploitation, and fascism if they need it. At this crucial juncture in our human history, we must lop off the head of capital once and for all and install a working class government, because only a working class government can plan a rational economy that meets the real needs of all people without simultaneously threatening all of us with the existential threats of climate change and pandemics on maybe an annual basis. We must unite because an infection to one is a risk to all. I look forward to the questions you're going to ask, and I look forward to hearing the remarks from the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Our next panelist is Siobhan O'Brien, and Siobhan is a senior PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in the Department of Biochemistry. As a teaching assistant, they are a member of CUPE. Welcome, Siobhan.
Thanks, Elizabeth. When I was asked by Daniel to maybe contribute some remarks to this, it really got me back to thinking about those few weeks in the summer where cases in Toronto reached single digits of COVID. And while everybody was still wearing masks and social distancing, it really felt like there were good days. And the numbers we saw each day sometimes were less than the day before, and things felt good. I think a lot of the ease that I felt was based on the fact that I both live and work in downtown Toronto and really don't leave, that bubble very often. But if you look to other areas of the city and surrounding regions, areas with a higher population density, higher proportions of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as multi-generational households, these wins really never occurred. The overrepresentation of these specific regions in COVID case rates is not a phenomenon that's just observed in the GTA. As anybody who is following case rates in the Toronto region, Peel, which contains a number of different multi-generational households and an overrepresentation of racialized populations, really leads the case rates these days. But these regions also have large proportions of essential workers, especially those in lower wage jobs such as hospitality, retail, shipping, factory and industrial work, as well as hospital support. A lot of groups who often commute into the surrounding cities to support the economy in these essential roles, and they're disproportionately affected by COVID infections. During our initial lockdown in Toronto, the majority of these workers kept on working. Frontline low-wage jobs were finally recognized as heroes that they are to this capitalist society, but this recognition came with a very minimal boost in pay that expired long before the pandemic has ended. Every day we see new cases in grocery store and fast food workers, workers who could never work from home, and workers who generally make some of the lowest wages in the society. Huge outbreaks have occurred in factory or large processing plants, workplaces where laborers work long hours, doing challenging physical labor, often without the support of union organizing. The province has protected a lot of these workers by withholding information around these outbreaks, which serves no one except the corporations behind these poor working conditions who disregard COVID protocols and prioritize profit over worker safety. In Ontario alone, as of early June, 14 healthcare workers have died from COVID-19 from a workplace exposure. The majority of these deaths have occurred in personal support workers who are paid just slightly above minimum wage to care for some of the most vulnerable people in our population. Many of these workers are vulnerable themselves. This past month, Doug Ford's progressive conservative government in Ontario has introduced legislation to protect these for-profit long-term care homes where both residents and workers are dying from any type of legal action. It really makes things clear where the priorities lie in this society. In Toronto alone, racialized groups represent 72% of COVID patients admitted to hospitals, while also disproportionately affected by COVID case rates. White people, who make up nearly 50% of the population in Toronto, share only 20% of the disease burden. The inherent racism of the response to COVID-19 is overwhelmingly clear. In data just released today, workers with an annual salary less than $30,000 per year are more than 5 times as likely to contract COVID-19 than those making six-figure salaries. The inherent classism of the response to COVID-19 is clear. Regions with high disease burden are met with very poor support. In the northwest area of Toronto, a region of lower socioeconomic status with the highest COVID case rates of any neighborhood in Toronto, public transit access is abhorrent. Reductions in services only worsen the situation. While crowding on public transit during a pandemic is shameful, reducing services that only increase crowding in neighborhoods with the highest COVID rates, really basically that house people who are the backbone of how this society functions, is a derelict of duty that more than likely resulted in preventable deaths. The forgotten neighborhoods of Toronto have remained forgotten. As the affluent, whiter neighborhoods work from home and battled over IKEA home office desks and chairs, our pandemic heroes have lower access to testing, lower access to transportation, lower access to PPE as we thrust them onto the front lines and then send them home unpaid for weeks when the inevitable happens and they get sick. The racist roots of COVID infection is not new information. It's happening worldwide, with Black, Indigenous, and people of color not only overrepresented in infection rates, but also in COVID-related deaths. At a time when movements that are pushing for both the acknowledgement and dismantling of systemic racism, Canadian governments remain completely blinded to the fact that by allowing COVID to grow out of control, as is happening here in Ontario, in Quebec, Manitoba, Alberta, and British Columbia, they're willfully allowing for the sickness and eventual death of racialized groups in every part of this country. When I think about when will the pandemic end, I realize that for so many families across Canada, over 10,000 right now and counting, it has changed the rest of their lives forever. For the long haulers, people who maintain long COVID symptoms for an undetermined amount of time at this point may never be the same. And it's a statistic that is not often collected. The sheer inability of our capitalist society to protect each other and the bullshit balancing act that is proposed at all levels of government, whether the progressive conservatives here in Ontario, the new Democrat government in British Columbia, or the federal Liberal government, they have all chosen to save businesses over people, and they continue to do so. For me, the pandemic will end when our governments are held accountable for the murderous decisions that they make and their prioritization of productivity over health. And I really hope that that comes in my lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Our next panelist is Dr. Ravi Mahood, and a leading member of Socialist Action League for Action Socialists in Montreal. He was the founder of the Morgentaler Clinic in Winnipeg, and he is a prominent pro-choice doctor. Welcome, Ravi. You're muted, Ravi.
I knew I would forget that.
That's okay.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to the two first presenters for really offering some very stimulating analyses and very pertinent, politically pertinent remarks about the pandemic. I'm probably not going to match the intensity of their remarks, but I think there are a number of questions that might be of interest to the audience that I will try to take up. So one of the most, the situation we're in now, just to remind everybody, is that there's a winter upsurge in cases in Europe and North America, at least, where there have really been inadequate preparations. And the result is that in several countries, in several regions of some countries, healthcare systems are approaching the limits of their capacity. So that's a potentially very serious situation. And it shows no sign of ending anytime soon in those parts of the world that I mentioned. Countries with public healthcare systems that have remained relatively intact tend to do better, especially those with a central epidemic command center and mass testing and contact tracing capacity. They've done the best overall. And the examples there would be China, Vietnam, South Korea, Cuba, I think, and as Daniel mentioned, Australia and New Zealand. There are, of course, countries that have really effectively abandoned any policy, even of containment. And the United States, Brazil, and India are probably the most egregious examples. Under Trump's Republican administration, there was outright negligence and refusal to support even modest public health measures to protect the population. But I'll leave that apart. I think everybody's familiar with that. Most countries, Canada included, have vacillated and gone back and forth between lockdown and reopening, depending on viral spread. This is essentially a reactive and not at all a proactive policy. It's a reactive policy, a very defensive policy. And countries like Canada with fragmented lines of authority and uncoordinated responses are in even deeper trouble. We're lucky to have gotten away with as little damage as we have, but Siobhan referred to the clear damage that's already been done and that it's borne disproportionately by people of lower socioeconomic status. So I think the previous speakers are quite right that we can't view a major pandemic such as the COVID-19 epidemic from the framework, from anything other than the framework of existing capitalism. And for this system, there really is there is an unavoidable contradiction between safeguarding lives versus safeguarding livelihoods. Now, a lot of governments want to be seen to be defending both, no matter how paltry and inadequate their efforts have been. And I guess we would include Canada in that category. But the fundamental reality is that capital is dependent on labor to generate and sustain profit. The capitalist class as a whole, then, is bound to favor reopening the economy as rapidly as possible. The result in many countries, including Canada, is that we've engaged in a series of over-optimistic projections and an inconsistent back and forth implementation of usually partial containment measures. Of course, it has to be said that workers are also dependent on capital for employment, and therefore they're caught up in the same problematic, which it's up to the workers' movement to try to overcome. Those workers who are without the option of working at home have no choice but to favor their livelihoods over their health or even their lives. The capital state may also cajole or coerce workers deemed essential into staying on the job regardless of health risk. So we see this in essential workers in agriculture and industry, especially in food production. We also see it in healthcare and education. And in many of these cases, well, really all of them, the workers have not been adequately compensated, and in many cases, their safety has not been optimized. Now, many questions about this pandemic remain unanswered. Does infection or a vaccine provide long-lasting immunity? Will vaccines prove efficacious? Who will be vaccinated is a very important question. Can several billion doses of vaccine be produced and delivered in time? How common is the so-called long COVID syndrome, and what will be its impact on sufferers? There's some preliminary evidence that prolonged COVID symptoms may occur in 1 in 5 persons affected by the virus. What kind of symptoms are we talking about? Well, anything from depression and anxiety, chronic fatigue, mild dyspnea, that is shortness of breath, cognitive deficits, memory impairment. And for how long? Well, we don't know the answer. There seems to be, in some cases, a prolonged course of several months at least. What is the risk of dying from COVID-19? The case fatality rate rises steeply with age, from 0.1% under the age of 50, 0.3% between 50 and 60, 1.3% between 60 and 69, 4.6% between 70 and 79, and over 25% in those over 80 who contract the virus. Now, this age gradient has been used to argue, notably by the signers of the Great Barrington Declaration, that we should try to achieve herd immunity by natural means without waiting for a vaccine. That is, these folks are really opposed to any stringent lockdown that damages the economy or diverts healthcare resources from elsewhere. The argument is to adopt specific measures to protect the most vulnerable, but to otherwise let the virus spread. There are many problems, I think, with this position. First of all, perhaps no more than 10% of the population has been infected so far. The virus, of course, is highly contagious, but even so, we are a long way from herd immunity. Further spread means more illness and death. It's not possible to wall off the elderly or other vulnerable groups from contagion, and from those who are asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic. I also think that robbing Peter to pay Paul is generally a bad idea. The answer to the diversion of resources away from medical priorities such as cancer care is to increase funding to those needed services, which were already squeezed by budget cuts even before the pandemic. The herd immunity now position tends to reinforce a cavalier approach. It fits with the mindset of those in varying stages of denial about the pandemic, and it conveniently serves the interests of employers and the political parties that want to get back to business as usual as soon as possible. I don't think that the comparison of influenza and COVID-19 are particularly useful. Infections change over the course of their endemicity. The first wave of the 1918 flu epidemic, for instance, was not that lethal. It was only with the second and third waves that millions died. COVID-19's infectivity and virulence may attenuate over time or may even increase. The mink saga that Daniel related is worrisome, to say the least. But at present, COVID-19 is still on the rising part of its curve, and in many countries has yet to reach its full penetrance. Even with a low infection fatality rate, well below 1%, by infecting hundreds of thousands or millions, COVID-19 can still kill a lot of people. Remember that we lack an effective vaccine that's deliverable, and we are a long way from herd immunity. Perhaps less, as I mentioned, less than 10% or even 5% of the population have been infected. We still know relatively little about this virus, and a lot will remain known until it has reached some sort of equilibrium. Many of us have seen the announcement that Pfizer has demonstrated proven efficacy in its mRNA vaccine in a phase 3 trial, giving rise to speculation a mass vaccination campaign could be rolled out as early as the new year, at least in the United States and some other rich capitalist countries. There are as well at least 10 other vaccines entering into phase 3 trials, and more than 50 worldwide are at some stage of development. It hardly escapes notice that it took an infection that swept through the rich capitalist part of the world to spur the development of a vaccine in what appears to be record time. Diseases that primarily affect the poorer parts of the world have not merited the same resources for vaccine or drug development, for that matter. Understandably, though, an effective vaccine appears as the silver bullet that can bring the pandemic under control. And the news that vaccines may soon be available is, encouraging to all of us, myself included at my age. But there are, unfortunately, several reasons for caution.
1 minute.
And potential hurdles. Pfizer's vaccine and several more based on the mRNA technology require storage at very low temperatures, as low as minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. These vaccines, I think, almost always are 2-dose vaccines requiring tracking and recall for the second dose. Although not insurmountable, these two aspects present significant logistical problems. But more than that, we need to develop herd immunity at the global level. The virus does not respect national boundaries. Instead of international cooperation to plan a response to the pandemic, we've seen a disorganized and chaotic situation. And some countries are even forced to withstand attempts to sabotage the health of their populations and face an increased burden of disease, of suffering and mortality. These are the states that have fallen out of favor with the imperialist powers and are subject to draconian sanctions when they are not the target of military intervention. And of course, I'm referring to countries such as Iran, Venezuela, Syria, and of course, Cuba. Instead of international cooperation to plan a response to the pandemic, we have a disorganized and chaotic response. Some countries are forced, I already said that. The WHO, of course, was greatly weakened even before Trump ordered the United States to quit that body. There's no guarantee of a vaccine for large swaths of the world's poorest people. With 13% of the global population, the rich countries have reserved more than half the vaccines from leading manufacturers. With a 2-vaccine schedule, that means producing and distributing 8 to 9 billion doses. Tremendous effort and resources will be needed to carry out this Herculean world-scale task.
Please wrap up, Robbie.
Yes, as most of you are aware, the last 2 decades have seen the emergence of an anti-science backlash in the developed world, coupled with anti-scientific skepticism, often for good reason, in the global south. Refusal to be vaccinated by a significant portion of the population is a real possibility and could become another obstacle to achieving herd immunity by the vaccine route. So I'll close there. It's a bit of a negative note, although I think there is reason for some optimism, but it's going to take a lot of struggle to get there. Thanks.
Thank you, Robbie. Okay, thank you all. And now, with the help of our technical producer, Kurt Young, we will air some questions from our online audience, and he will read out the first 3 questions, and he will also put them in the chat. And you will each have up to 5 minutes to answer one or all 3. And we're going to start with Siobhan, then Robbie, then Daniel. So Kurt, please read the questions.
All right, so our first question comes from John Orrit. He asked, does this virus not come from bats? Is this incorrect? Bats are hardly farm-raised and widely traded and exported. Our next question comes from Abby C. And she asks, what's something the average person can do today to make a difference in combating agribusiness in future pandemics? And our third question comes from John Rydell. He asks, I noticed that COVID infection rates in China and some other countries are very low compared with the situation in Canada. Is there anything we can learn from their experiences?
Okay, folks, you've heard the 3 questions, so we'll start with Siobhan. You have 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. I think I'm going to address the third question. What we can do, kind of what we're not doing and what these other countries are doing to get their rates low. And I think that it's really widespread testing. I mean, people who in the audience who are from Ontario, we had really low cases and really open access to testing. And when that was reduced, people stopped getting tested, our test positivity increased, and there's really been a number of outbreaks that really can't be linked back. So I think that really wide and open testing and in some cases forced testing of the population where you can, I mean, some countries, like I think Slovakia has recently been in the news, are testing every single person in their country so they know where it's hiding, because there is this layer of asymptomatic people. Also, what a lot of countries are doing, which we're not doing to a large scale here, is sequencing of the virus itself. So when you collect the sample from the patient, you can actually sequence the exact genetic code for that isolate from a person. And by doing this for every sample that you collect, you can trace where these isolates are coming from and pinpoint exact outbreaks, whether there's a source in Ontario or it's being imported from other countries. And that type of, more expensive route has been really successful in other jurisdictions. So something I think that we could easily do. And again, in Canada alone, if you look to the Atlantic provinces, they're doing phenomenally. Even with this fall surge in cases, they are seeing a few, but it's really pennies compared to what's happening everywhere else. And they have maintained their strict rules about social distancing, mask wearing, limiting occupancy in all types of businesses, as well. They have a mandatory quarantine rule, so they're not importing cases from other places. So I think that by using kind of all 3 of these, mass testing, tracing based on sequencing of the virus, and really strong, public health measures that include quarantine with travel from anywhere, I think that at least in Ontario, we could be doing a lot better.
Thank you, Siobhan. Robbie, 5 minutes.
Myself, in response to John's remark about bats not being farm raised, you're quite correct. I think it's partly agribusiness, but it includes a lot of other factors that impinge on formerly secluded or forested areas, and it includes the timber industry. It includes all kinds of other encroachments besides agribusiness, although agribusiness has been connected to some of the pandemics in the last 20 years, quite a few of them actually. So I think what we're seeing is that we're just capitalist agriculture and capitalist exploitation of the natural environment encroaches upon these formerly secluded areas of the world and breaks down the natural barriers to the transmission of viruses and allows them to jump and create another future for themselves at our expense. I think it's also important to recognize that the mechanism of transmission and proliferation of these infections very much depends on the globalized capitalist system with its rapid communication and travel based on primarily on the airline industry. I mean, it was always the case that pandemics spread through trade routes and through travel, going back to the era of the plague years in Europe. But now it happens, you know, at a fraction of the time that it used to take. And this is definitely another way in which capitalism promotes the spread of the virus once it's been released from its natural habitat. I think that there are probably many lessons to be learned from China. And it certainly is one of the countries that had a capacity to move very quickly and rapidly. After an initial fumbling, I think they did pivot and show the world what can be done with a very determined public health response, which involves quite vigorous measures, including quarantining, tracking, tracing, and isolating sources of infection. I think the question of combating agribusiness is there's nothing that could be done quickly, but I think there are already some important movements which offer alternatives to industrialized capitalist agriculture. And I'm thinking of organizations like Via Campesina and a large upsurge of militancy on the part of farming people in the global south, often indigenous in their ethnic origin, but not exclusively. And not just in the global south, it's spread also to parts of North America and Europe. So I think there is hope in terms of movement politics. What needs to happen is a much more vigorous series of demands that are made on the state to rein in these very destructive practices.
Thank you, Robbie. Daniel?
Yes, I thank all the people that asked the questions. This is a great set of initial questions. So all of them have already been answered quite well, but I'm going to pick up a bit where Robbie just left off on the question about what the average person can do in this struggle against agribusiness and environmental exploitation. So thank you, Abby, for that question. You have land defenders all around the world, and Robbie correctly pointed out a lot of these are indigenous people, not exclusively. It's also unfortunate that they're the ones targeted by violence, either mercenaries hired by corporations or the state itself. So you have people being murdered repeatedly. You got murdered the one time, but you have multiple different people being murdered to try and stifle these movements to protect land, protect forests, to prevent the further expansion of industrial farms. So it's brave work. It's necessary work. Otherwise, I think the question about what the average person can do is often weaponized, where we're made to feel guilty for our individual consumption and our practices of consumption, where we don't have as much of a say as what shows up at the supermarket as we like to think. This idea that if we, just stop buying red meat as much, the beef industry will kind of whittle away, when at the same time, their connections with government, the subsidies they get to prop up the industry is just massive. And the way that they can prevent other alternatives from happening and coming to the grocery stores, it's a stacked deck against us. So I don't really recommend that people feel guilty about what they purchase as an individual, but the socialist movement and the eco-socialist movement specifically are absolutely vital to, again, put humans, like everyday working class people, at the table when making decisions about how we feed ourselves, how we treat and use our natural resources. Because I imagine we'd find solutions where we can all still have enough to eat, with minimizing waste in the system and bringing it down to more local levels. So this is, I mean, and like Robbie mentioned, it's a long struggle. And John, yeah, absolutely, the virus came from a bat. You're right, bats aren't necessarily raised, but again, as Robbie already mentioned, as you deforest and you start setting up new industrial farms in areas where you had tons of bats living and are just natural reservoirs, it can spread to the pigs or other livestock. That's what happened with Nipah virus. That's really kind of in the fruit bats normally, and then it first went to humans that worked in the pig slaughterhouses. So the pigs got it. The pigs weren't as affected as humans would be, but when it jumped to humans, they died like crazy. So bats are a massive reservoir of viruses. People don't really know this. It blew my mind when I heard this earlier this year. But 20% of all mammalian species are bats. There's 5,000 mammalian species, 1,000 are bats. So there's just so much potential for different viruses to be hanging out in that population. And as we get closer into those environments, they're going to start spreading it through the agribusiness that provides the perfect breeding ground, because you have a bunch of genetically identical animals. So it's not the case that different animals have different amounts of immunity. So it can just run rampantly through this. And when all the animals are so close together, there's no penalty for being very deadly. Normally, if a virus kills someone before they can transmit it to someone else, that's not a successful virus. But if you're in a situation where everybody's crowded together, or the animals are all crowded together, a virus can kill people without any penalty because it will transmit very easily due to the proximity. So no one's surprised in the scientific community, I guess, that these are the breeding ground for these viruses. But obviously corporate interests weigh more heavily in the decisions made here.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Okay, so I do believe our producers told me that we probably got 6 questions left, so I'm going to try to do all 6 if possible, but we cannot take any more because we'll be running out of time. So Kurt will now put the next 3 questions to our panelists, and they will have, once again, 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes each to speak. And the lineup will be Robbie, Siobhan, and Daniel. So Kurt, go ahead.
Okay, so our first question comes from Tom Baker. He says, yes, agribusiness contributes to viral spread, mixing, and amplification, especially outside Canada where uncontrolled production growth takes place. Are there not also other contributors? Rosemary, I believe, asks, are we as a global society in a position to dismantle intensive livestock production and still feed the world population? And then our last question, but from Murray Jones, what can we learn from the fact that China, Vietnam, and Cuba, all governed by communist parties, have the lowest COVID infection rate and death rates?
Okay, so we'll go back to our panel. You have up to 5 minutes to answer one or all or none. And we will start with Robbie. Put on your mic, Robbie.
Sorry, I'm very forgetful.
That's okay.
I had COVID.
We all are.
Yes, in answer to Tom's question, well, you're quite right. It isn't just agribusiness. It's a whole system of breaking down the barriers to transmission of viruses from animal to human, which is not unprecedented, but it's an accelerating phenomenon as the era of globalized capitalist production and trade have become the norm. So I think that anything that, as I tried to stress, anything that disturbs and disrupts the natural barriers to the spread of infection can be a factor in the epidemics which we're increasingly seeing. So can we do without intensive livestock production? Well, I certainly hope so, for all kinds of reasons, including that of climate degradation, which I don't want to pretend that livestock is completely responsible in any way, but it is a contributor to climate degradation. And the most important thing is that we're talking about livestock that's raised for external markets in countries like Brazil, and is not really for a domestic market. You know, the question how much international trade there should be in basic food commodities, I think that's up to the future to determine. But I think that these kind of intensive livestock raising is counterproductive, except for those who seek and get profit from it. What can we learn from the fact that China, Vietnam, and Cuba all governed by communist parties? Well, maybe we should have a communist party. Well, I think what's common to these countries is that because of the legacy of revolution or the destruction of capitalist property relations, even if we think that there's been some regression in that respect, that has left these countries with the capacity to carry out programs that are directed at and consider the interests of the whole population. And I think it's not the secret of their success, because it's a multifactorial thing, which countries do well and which don't. But undoubtedly, these have given China, Vietnam, and Cuba a definite advantage in tackling the pandemic. And the proof is there, because they all have succeeded in containing it, and in fact, reducing the threat from the virus.
Thank you, Robbie. Siobhan?
Yeah, I think I will also just speak to the third question, because I don't know that much about agribusiness. But in terms of kind of what is common with these countries that seem to have done well, I think, as Robbie mentioned, there's a lot of supports in place that really support people who need to be quarantined, for example, like food, medicine is delivered to people's homes if they need to be quarantined, which basically, you know, ups the rates and the ability of these people to perform those quarantines if they do get sick. As well, I think it's just less so, you know, prioritizing these corporations over people. I mean, really locally, in every Doug Ford presser, the Premier of Ontario, he goes on and on and on about small business owners and how we feel so badly for them because they're struggling. But I feel badly also. A lot of people are struggling. It's a really tough time, but there's no mention to the people who are dying every day. And there's no mention to the people who are forced to work terrified that they're going to get sick and bring it home to their parents or their grandparents. So I think that, you know, redistributing or changing that focus to be on the benefit of everybody instead of trying to support business while not actually supporting them, because, you know, he cries all the time about how he feels so badly for them, but will never cut a check so that they can close safely and protect people. So, I mean, how much does he really care? But I think that it's, focusing on the people more than the corporations and supporting these people so that we can do it. I mean, China's lockdown, I think everyone was watching so closely because we were kind of, you know, expecting it to come here, and they haven't really had a second wave to the same degree that we had. None of these countries have. So I think that, you know, doing that directed testing that I mentioned in the last questions, as well as, you know, having this people-focused plan of, it doesn't matter, we'll close businesses, we'll give them money, we'll whatever, people will get their paychecks, but we need to stop this. And that's not happening really anywhere in Canada. Thanks.
Thank you, Siobhan. Daniel?
Yeah, thanks again. Another great round of questions. I'm just going to quickly jump off of something that Siobhan said. Exactly. Small businesses are kind of weaponized. You know, think of the small business, but there's an obvious solution here, which is cancel rent. So not just a rent moratorium, just cancel rent. So if they don't have those expenses, you can also potentially give small businesses some cash relief. And then for all the big corporations, screw them. They should have been saving. So yeah, absolutely. Where's the bailout for everyday people? Instead, we get bailout for corporations that then just lobby for all of us to go back to work so they can still not only be bailed out, but also make a bunch of money from the economy restarting. They want everything, and they will take it if we don't fight them for it. So in terms of Tom's question about other contributors to viral spread, and I agree, absolutely. There's a lot of things, and I mean, to have a really comprehensive breakdown, we'd be here for a very long time. Not that I would mind. Climate change is a big one. As soon as some areas start getting warmer, you have increased spread of certain pests. So this is something they're talking about with tropical diseases as northern and southern countries further from the equator start warming up. Mosquitoes carrying certain parasites can now travel more north and more south and potentially infect a greater range of people. So that's a really big contributor. And then in terms of Rosemary's question about are we ready to dismantle intensive livestock and still feed the population, that's a question I've received a lot. Personally, I'm a vegan, and it's not something that I do as a strategy, I guess. I really don't see the benefit at a personal level, like I mentioned, but it's just a habit I've gotten into now. But the amount of food it takes to feed livestock, to bring them to the point where you can slaughter them and then we eat the meat, could also just feed the entire world many times over. So the food's there. We definitely a more sustainable diet for the world would be one that's more plant intensive. And we're already growing that. It's just we're using it to feed all these animals, and just metabolically, just basic metabolism. The amount of plants you have to feed a cow to get to a certain size where you can slaughter it, it's just it just explodes in the amount of food you need to go through that process. And then generally, I mean, we can start bringing livestock and farms back to local environments where they're run by the community. Rob Wallace, in that book that I've mentioned quite a few times called Big Farm Makes Big Flu, recommends diversifying back to heirloom stocks. So that way you have like firewalls. What might be able to infect one breed might not be able to infect another one. So the virus doesn't have as many evolutionary paths out into the human population. So you bring it down, smaller scale, less meat. And then with the land that we already have cultivated for these massive industrial agribusiness corporations, just bring that back to plants, fruits, vegetables, more plants, fruit, vegetables in the urban centers. I mean, it's not a coincidence that so many people, especially poor people, live in food deserts where not only is there no grocery stores around, there's no farms, there's no community gardens that can actually sustain people. We need to bring that back. So shout out to my very good friend, Matt Steckel, who is taking on this challenge in the poor parts of Windsor right now in the West End with a bunch of other community groups and radicals. That is something I guess individuals can do, is to start building up those resources in the local area. And I think that's just a naturally radicalizing process to take on the task of food distribution for yourself and make that a community effort and endeavor, and not just as a hobby, but as an actual strategy to lessen our reliance on the corporations around us. But obviously that's not something most people have the time for, because it's also not a coincidence that we have to work sometimes multiple jobs to afford rent. So we can, but it takes planning, and it takes direct action as well at times.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Okay, so we're going to go back to Kurt for our last round of questions, and you will have up to 5 minutes once again. And the lineup will be Daniel, Siobhan, and Robbie. So Kurt, our last questions.
All right, so our first question comes from Barry Weisletter. He asks, climate change, consumer practices change, or system change? A workers' government, a planned economy in harmony with nature is possible only if the majority take charge of our destiny. How can we achieve that other than by a socialist revolution led by a conscious organized body, a revolutionary working class party? John Orr asks, should human beings not only adopt socialism to combat agribusiness, but also reduce their own numbers to give more environmental space to other plant and animal species? Abby C asks, could lab-grown meat have positive effect on reducing human contact with livestock?
Okay, so you've heard the three questions. We're going to start with Daniel, then Siobhan and Robbie. Each have up to 5 minutes.
Okay.
Daniel?
So again, great panel so far, great questions. Barry, I feel like it's a bit of a leading question because obviously I agree. You're right. It's only when the majority, the workers, the people that do the work, are in charge of making decisions that you can find something that's rational and that works to provide the needs of people, but without leading to an existential threat. Because our priorities, I mean, we live in the communities where we work. So I find it hard to imagine a community voting to create these highly toxic, destructive agribusinesses in their own backyard. No one wants to live next to these things. It's not a coincidence that the poorest parts of towns are, you know, where you might have the slaughterhouses and that smell just hangs in the air and the toxic effluent is going into the groundwater. So if the community gets to decide collectively how it's going to use its shared resources and its collective labor, then you're going to find a nice balance between having enough time for leisure, producing enough food so people can eat comfortably, but also in a way where the local environment's not destroyed and people aren't at risk of pollution and ecosystem collapse. It's only when we allow the capitalists to control all the means of production, all the factories, well, their priorities are different. Their priorities are profit in their competition with each other. And that profit will be fought for viciously, even if it's at the expense of the majority. And that's why you see a bunch of billionaires now, you know, building their dream bunkers in New Zealand or in the Canadian Rockies, and they have their helicopters ready to leave at a moment's notice if things really, you know, shit hits the fan. So they know what they're doing. It's just, that's the inevitable outcome of capitalism. So yeah, as workers, we're in a fight for our lives and for the habitableness of our planet. John's question about should we also reduce our own numbers as a way of combating things like climate change? It's an interesting question. A lot of people, I think, sometimes default to that. It sometimes comes out of this nihilistic mindset. You know, it's just we have too many people on the planet. That's a lie. I think that's really sold by a lot of our industrialized neoliberal governments, where the problem isn't, you know, our corporations. It's, you know, the billions of people in India and China, and they're just, you know, polluting too much. Whereas per capita, they pollute way less than we do, and a lot of the companies over there that are causing all this pollution are owned by American companies or European companies. So they're going there to exploit the cheap labor and the lax regulations at times. So, I mean, we have enough resources on the planet. We produce way more than we need to feed the planet many times over. There's a lot of artificial scarcity that comes with capitalism. And things aren't managed in a way to be sustainable. You can, you know, at some point the math comes for a capitalist. We're just gonna make so much, and if we have to, you know, throw half of it, we still make more money if we sell it all. You know, the math works out in a really perverse way when you consider just the natural limits of our planet. So in terms of having to reduce our numbers conscientiously, I say no. I think we have enough resources to go around. I'm also wary of any person, I think, that starts, you know, using that as their lead platform, their lead solution. It's kind of eco-fascisty, where it's, you know, to save the environment, we just need to, you know, get rid of all the people in India or in China. And I'm not saying this is your opinion, but I have seen this from some people. And it tends to be some liberal yuppies shopping at a co-op where I was working during the pandemic, and they're coming in there. And some of them are like, oh, this pandemic, you know, it kind of sucks, but, you know, we really needed to reduce the population. And so this kind of gets to what Siobhan was talking about earlier about how even disproportionately the pandemic affects people, where you have some people that are happy it's around. It's like, I just have to work from home. It's annoying. But at least we're, you know, killing all these people that are polluting the planet. It's like, I think you're misidentifying who's the enemy in this situation. And lab-grown meat, I mean, I'm not against lab-grown meat. Can it be scaled up to fully replace all the meat that people already consume? Probably not. But as a strategy to reduce our reliance on livestock as a source of meat, I say, sure, why not? But again, any lab-grown meat should be run by the workers in that corporation and not run by private interests for profit. So let's get some lab-grown meat co-ops going.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, and Siobhan?
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of follow up on what Daniel just said about the lab-grown meat. I mean, I think absolutely in your question, you mentioned that it would reduce human contact with livestock. 100%, it absolutely would. But then there's like layers of other issues on top of it. Environmentalism, I mean, lab-grown meat is grown in plastic, and at huge scalable levels, it is grown in a huge scalable amount of plastic. And so it wouldn't necessarily be more environmentally conscious than livestock. I mean, maybe if it is at a reduced capacity, I'm not totally sure, but I think that absolutely it would reduce contact with livestock. Not sure, environmentally how much the impact that would be. And then kind of the other two comments about, yeah, I think having like a worker focused society will change a lot of how we interact with, our world around us. When you kind of remove the profit motivation from something, there's less drive to destroy all of these habitats, because really as workers and as smaller community groups, we just need to provide for ourselves and each other. And so when you remove that, and you kind of look more locally to get, the food and staples that you need to survive, I think that you kind of work within the environmental space that you already have, instead of pushing further and further into a lot of these kind of riskier areas that's happening worldwide. So I think bringing it both more locally as well as in a worker focused, kind of person focused way versus profit focused, then absolutely it would, I think, reduce a lot of this. And a lot of the risk that kind of goes along with encroaching on these areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Siobhan. Robbie? Microphone.
Yeah, I'm onto it.
Alrighty.
Well, my reaction to John and to Abby is not meant to be a hostile one particularly, but I do think that we're not going to get very far if we look for what seems to me to be a kind of technical solution, whether it lies in population control or something like artificial meat. I'm not opposed to giving these questions consideration. First of all, on population limitation, seems to me that the most important factors that would promote that, because there's an element of coercion here that has not worked out very well for many people in the poorer parts of the world in the past. I think that the answer to that is to empower women. First of all, women need to be just to see some important aspects of their emancipation realized, in particular, control over their own bodies, birth control and abortion rights. I think we have to leave it up to women to play a major role in determining the pace of reproduction for the species, and certainly now and even well into the future. I don't envisage even a socialist society laying down the law and saying, well, you can only have one child. It may come to that, but I'm not prepared to go there yet. And I think likewise with lab-grown meat, again, it's a kind of looking for a technical fix to something that really is a social and economic problem. And we've tied ourselves into a model of meat production, which is destructive of the environment because of the scale of it and the intensity of it, which is directed towards profit. I think I would say in response to Barry that the disasters that have been visited upon us as a species, and as well the planet and other species by capitalism, is especially in its most recent imperialist stage. All of these things argue for its replacement by a world socialist order in which democratic planning can heal the rift between humanity and nature. And that's really what we're talking about, is that there is a rift between, in the metabolism of the planet, between the human species and nature. And that is something we want to heal. We want to bridge the gap between those two, which capitalism has greatly exacerbated. So I think that will require the mobilization and conscious intervention of the working class, broadly, and the oppressed, broadly defined, and the construction, as a matter of fact, also of a revolutionary socialist party. I don't think we can we can achieve that objective without those two, without the mobilization of those two elements, the class as a whole and the oppressed as a whole, and the role of a revolutionary party in that process. That's it.
Okay, thank you. And a special thanks to all of our panelists, Daniel, Siobhan, Robbie, and of course to our producer, Kurt Young in Mississauga, and everybody else who participated with the questions. Please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action. It's only $27 a year, and it can be delivered to your door. Socialist Action newspaper. To fill out the form, just visit our website, www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to Socialist Action Canada at gmail.com, or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. And once again, folks, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. Now, our next essay webcast is 9 days from now. It's on a Saturday, not a Thursday, because it's a special. In fact, it's back-to-back webcasts, and it's on November the 21st at 4 p.m. and at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Socialist Action Canada presents an international education for activists conference. The theme is Revolution or Ruin, an online gathering to address the multiple crises of world capitalism. So it's Saturday, November the 21st. The first session is at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it's titled The Change We Need. The second session is at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The title is How to Get It. In addition to great speakers from across Canada, the USA, and Greece, there will be songs by Emily Steers and Y.C. Lee and a poem by Alex Vadila. And also, folks, to help offset the cost of advertising this conference and any other work of Socialist Action, if you're so inclined, you can go to www.socialistaction.ca and follow the link and leave a donation at any time. And for the details again, www.socialistaction.ca. In the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and be active. Bye for now.